The fat banker's son, they all mocked, until the beautiful opera singer said, "I choose him over every prince." If you insist on shaming our name with that bloated boy who pounds at a keyboard instead of a ledger, you will cease to be my son, Harrison Whitmore said, every syllable clipped like a banker's shears. Snow sifted down over Boston in the winter of 1882, dissolving into the gas-lit sheen of Tremont Street. Inside the Grand Opera House, velvet curtains breathed, chandeliers burned like captive constellations, and the city's finest sharpened their judgments the way tenors honed their high notes. Marcus Whitmore, broad-chested, round-bellied, face gentled by years of trying not to take up space, sat alone in a shadowed box, hands trembling as Isabella Rossini lifted her chin to meet Puccini's opening phrase. Her first note found him like warm light under ice. By the time "O mio babbino caro" unfurled its plea, the boy whom Boston had turned into a punchline felt something in his chest unlock, as if an invisible door had finally been persuaded by kindness. Around him, lorgnettes glittered, whispers slithered, old money counted sins. But on stage, a woman's voice made a cathedral out of air, and in that sanctuary he remembered he could be more than a weight, more than a wince. Backstage, fate waited with a stack of sheet music and an unsigned letter already written in a neat, careful hand. In the house, a prince or two measured Isabella like property. In the dark, a banker's son measured himself against beauty and didn't look away. Isabella Rossini had sung for kings, but it was the silence after the music that always frightened her most. Born in a small village near Florence, she'd risen from poverty through nothing but talent and will. Her mother scrubbed floors in opera houses. Her father tuned pianos until his hands bled. When Isabella's voice broke through the noise of their hardship, the world took notice and never stopped taking. By 28, she was the toast of Europe, the soprano with the voice dipped in gold. Every count, duke, and would-be prince wanted her hand, or at least the illusion of owning her. Behind their gifts and compliments lay the same hunger to possess what they could never understand. She smiled through the applause, bowed to the adoration, and went home each night to an empty dressing room where the mirrors reflected beauty, but not peace. America had been meant as an escape, a new tour, a new audience, oceans away from gossip. Yet even here, beneath the glitter of Boston chandeliers, she felt the same weariness, the same loneliness that no encore could cure, until the night she received an unsigned letter after her performance. The handwriting was careful, unassuming. The words, however, were alive. Your music makes the world pause, not because of beauty alone, but because you remind us that pain can sound like prayer. Enclosed was a single sheet of music, a melody unlike any she'd heard. It was tender, aching, written by someone who knew both humiliation and hope. At the bottom, there was no name, only a silent admirer. Isabella read the letter 3 times, then sat at her piano and played the melody. By the final note, tears had blurred the keys. Whoever this admirer was, he spoke to her in the only language she trusted, music. When her manager discovered the composer's identity, a banker's son the city mocked for his size, Isabella ignored his warning laugh. "He's no one of importance," the man said. She replied softly, "Anyone who writes like that is someone of importance to me." And so, one afternoon, while snow whispered against the opera house windows, Isabella Rossini asked to meet Marcus Whitmore. Marcus Whitmore had been taught that silence was safer than song. His father, Harrison, believed that a man's worth could be tallied on a ledger, not a staff of notes. Music is for dreamers and beggars, he'd said when Marcus was a boy. You will learn the language of profit. But Marcus's heart refused arithmetic. At 10, he was sneaking into the parlor at night to play the family piano, his fingers clumsy but full of feeling. By 20, he could make ivory keys sound like confession. By 30, he'd learned to hide it again. The world around him was cruel to softness, and Marcus had plenty of that. Softness in body, in voice, in the way he flinched when people laughed behind gloved hands. He spent his days buried in the family bank, ink-stained, obedient, invisible. At night, when Boston's gaslights flickered like faint courage, he composed pieces no one would ever hear. He never imagined his music might travel farther than the four walls of his room until Isabella Rossini sang. Her voice was what he had always tried to write, beauty tangled with ache. The night he saw her perform O mio babbino caro, something inside him trembled awake. He left the opera house changed, returning home not as the banker's disappointment, but as a man with something to say. He poured his heart into a letter that would never bear his name. The words came in a rush, honest and unpolished, admiration, gratitude, a confession he dared not speak aloud. He copied one of his melodies, the one that had come to him as she sang, and folded it inside. From a silent admirer, he signed. It was enough. Days passed. Then came the impossible, a message from the opera house inviting him to meet Isabella Rossini. Marcus thought it was a cruel prank. But when he arrived, coat too tight across his chest, palms sweating, she was there in a room of mirrors and pianos, smiling as though he were expected. "You're the one who wrote this," she said, holding up his music. He nodded, barely able to breathe. "It was nothing," he murmured. She laughed softly. "Nothing? Then I must have wasted my tears on it." He dared to meet her eyes. In that gaze he saw no mockery, no pity, only warmth, like sunlight on marble, long thought, cold. That afternoon they played together, her voice rising, his hands trembling across the keys. When the last note faded, she looked at him with a wonder he couldn't name, and whispered, "You hear the world as I feel it?" He would remember that line for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed became a quiet symphony of discovery. Each afternoon, when the theater emptied and Boston's carriages rolled home, Isabella and Marcus met in the rehearsal room, a space of polished wood, mirrors, and lingering echoes. He would sit at the piano, shoulders hunched, fingers hesitant at first. She would stand beside him, her voice unfolding into the empty hall like light filling a cathedral. Together they created a sound neither had known before, music not meant for applause, but for truth. At first, Marcus kept his distance, too aware of his clumsy frame reflected in the mirrors. "You should find someone more graceful to accompany you," he'd mutter, refusing to meet her eyes. Isabella only smiled. "Grace has nothing to do with beauty, Marcus. It lives in sincerity, and you play with more grace than any man I've ever known." Those words undid him. No one, not his family, not his friends, not even the teachers who praised his talent, had ever spoken to him without measurement or judgment. With Isabella, every note felt like forgiveness. She learned his language, how his fingers hesitated before a difficult chord, how his breath quickened when she reached the high notes. He learned hers, how her smile faltered when the audience demanded too much, how her laughter returned only when the music did. They shared coffee between rehearsals, laughter between verses, and stories between silences. One afternoon, snow pressed against the tall windows, muting the world. Isabella arrived wrapped in a shawl, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Marcus was already there, playing softly to himself, a melody tender and unresolved. She listened a long while before asking, "What is that piece?" He looked up, startled. I, I don't know. It came to me when I thought of you." "Then finish it," she said simply, "and I'll sing it." They worked for hours without speaking, the piano and her voice weaving together until sound and soul became indistinguishable. When the final note hung trembling in the air, Isabella reached out, placing her hand over his. "This," she whispered, "is what love sounds like." Marcus didn't move. He was too afraid that any motion might break the fragile miracle between them. After that day, something shifted. Their rehearsals became less about perfection, more about peace. They no longer sought to impress, but to understand. When Isabella's voice faltered from exhaustion, Marcus stopped playing, stood, and draped his coat over her shoulders without a word. When he doubted himself, she would rest her hand on his chest and say, "The world mocked what it could not fathom. Let it. You were born to make it listen." One evening, after a performance, Isabella found Marcus waiting for her behind the theater. The city was hushed beneath a new snowfall. Without a word, she took his hand and led him into the park, where lamplight glowed faintly through frost. "Do you know what I think when I sing your music?" she asked. He shook his head, afraid to speak. "I think," she said softly, "that God made you out of silence, so that the world could hear what kindness sounds like." He closed his eyes, unable to answer. The snow fell thicker, muffling the distance between them, until all that remained was the warmth of her hand and the faint hum of the melody they had written together. That was their silent bond, two broken hearts finding harmony not through words, but through the spaces between them. And though the world outside still laughed at the fat banker's son and the foreign diva, in that winter-lit room they were no longer mocked, no longer alone. They were simply, finally, music. Beauty has never been safe in the hands of envy. As Isabella and Marcus's partnership deepened, whispers began to slither through Boston's drawing rooms. The opera's shining star, they said, had given her heart to a grotesque banker's son, a man unfit to stand beside her, much less compose for her. It was scandal served cold and delicious, and society feasted on it. Marcus's father heard the rumors first. Harrison Whitmore's temper was a storm the household feared. He summoned his son to his study, a room of mahogany, marble, and merciless light. "You've embarrassed this family," he hissed, tossing a newspaper across the desk. "Opera's angel and the banker's buffoon," the headline screamed. "That woman is using you. End it, or I end you." Marcus straightened his shoulders for the first time in his father's presence. "Then end me," he said quietly, "because I won't give her up." He left the mansion that night with nothing but a coat and the sheet music they'd written together. But the true blow came from across the ocean. Count Alessandro de' Medici, Isabella's former suitor and the embodiment of aristocratic spite, had followed her to America. His jealousy sharpened into vengeance. He began spreading poison in every salon and paper, claiming Isabella had borne an illegitimate child in Italy and abandoned it for fame. He produced letters, fabricated but convincing, and even staged witnesses. Boston, ever eager to devour the exotic, turned cruel overnight. Crowds booed her performances. Pamphlets printed caricatures of her with a baby in her arms. The theater board threatened to cancel her contract. Isabella tried to stay strong, but one evening after rehearsal, she collapsed into Marcus's arms, trembling. "Maybe he's won," she whispered. "Maybe we should stop before you lose everything, too." Marcus held her tightly. "If I lose the world defending the truth, then it's the world's loss, not mine. You are my honor, Isabella." He decided to uncover the truth himself. With the help of a private investigator, he traced Alessandro's trail back to Europe. For 3 bitter months, he traveled through snow and sea, London, Paris, Florence, collecting scraps of evidence, the forged stationery, the paid informants, the printer who had produced the false letters. When he returned, gaunt and exhausted, he asked for the opera house itself to host a public hearing. The city came hungry for spectacle, expecting humiliation. On stage, under the same chandeliers where he'd once sat unseen, Marcus laid his findings bare. Calmly, methodically, he dismantled every lie. He read the confession of a Parisian forger, showed the receipts bearing Alessandro's signature, even summoned the old priest from Isabella's village, who swore under oath that she had never borne a child. The Count turned pale, his swagger unraveling under the gaslight. "You did this," Marcus said, voice steady as iron, "because you mistook cruelty for power. But power belongs to those who tell the truth, and I am done being silent." A murmur rippled through the hall, then applause, first a trickle, then a wave. The Count tried to flee, but the police were waiting. As he was led away, Isabella rose from her seat and walked to Marcus, her eyes brimming. Before the gathered crowd, she threw her arms around him. "This," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "is the man I choose over every prince, over every fortune, over every lie." The applause became thunder. The city that had mocked him now cheered his name. For the first time, Marcus Whitmore did not hide his face. He simply closed his eyes, holding her, and let the sound of their vindication fill the air like the final note of a symphony. Boston had never sounded so quiet. In the days after the public reckoning, the opera house stood transformed, not by paint or plaster, but by reverence. Where once there had been sneers and scandal, there was applause that came from the heart. Isabella Rossini was no longer the foreign curiosity. She was the voice of truth. And Marcus Whitmore, once whispered about as the fat banker's son, had become the city's unexpected hero. Newspapers printed his name with respect. The same critics who had mocked his size now praised his courage, calling him the mind behind the melody that restored an angel's wings. Yet Marcus cared little for redemption in ink. His victory was simpler, softer. The sound of Isabella's laughter when she walked freely again down Tremont Street, her head high, her hand safely in his. At home, in a modest apartment overlooking the harbor, they began their life anew. He played the piano by the window while she warmed soup on the stove. The evenings smelled of rosemary and coal smoke. The nights hummed with music and contentment. They had no fortune. Harrison Whitmore had made good on his threat and struck Marcus from the family estate, but they had peace, and for the first time Marcus felt wealthy. Weeks later, an unexpected knock echoed through the hallway. Marcus opened the door to find his father standing there, aged and uncertain, a newspaper folded under his arm. "I read what you did," Harrison said quietly. His voice, once hard as marble, now wavered. I misjudged you all your life. You've built something stronger than money. You built a name worth carrying. Marcus's breath caught. He had imagined this moment countless times, and yet forgiveness came easier than pride. Father, he said gently, it was never your approval I needed, only your belief. Harrison lowered his head. Then let me start believing now. They embraced, awkward at first, then fiercely. The past fell away like winter frost beneath the warmth of spring. When Marcus and Isabella married that following May, the city bells rang for them. Harrison Whitmore walked her down the aisle himself, his hand steady as if to make amends for every cruelty. Isabella wore white silk that shimmered like morning light. Marcus, nervous but radiant, waited at the altar as she approached. The same melody he'd written for her years before played softly by the orchestra. Before the priest could begin, Isabella turned to the guests and said, I once sang for emperors, but no audience has ever moved me more than this man's kindness. Marcus taught me that love, like music, finds its beauty in imperfection. Marcus took her hands, his voice breaking. And you taught me that courage doesn't roar, it sings. When their vows ended, the church erupted in applause, but Marcus only heard one sound, her whispered "Ti amo," as their foreheads touched. That night, as twilight fell over the harbor, the two of them stood by the window of their small home. Isabella's wedding veil fluttered like a ghost of all they had survived. Marcus wrapped his arm around her waist and said, Listen. To what? She asked. The city, he murmured. It's finally quiet enough to hear the music. Years later, when Boston's skyline grew higher and its streets busier, people still spoke of the banker's son who defied his father and the opera singer who chose him over every prince. Their story had turned into something more than gossip. It had become a kind of parable whispered in theaters and drawing rooms that the heart measures differently than the world does. Marcus and Isabella built a small music academy near Beacon Hill. It was not grand, but the sound of children's laughter filled its halls, blending with the notes of pianos and violins. They opened it for anyone, poor, rich, immigrant, forgotten, believing that talent belonged to no class. On its doors hung a simple inscription carved by Marcus himself. Music belongs to the soul, not the pedigree. Harrison Whitmore, once a man of numbers, visited often in his later years. He would sit quietly in the corner, listening to his son teach harmony to children, his eyes misted with something that resembled prayer. One afternoon, as Marcus ended a lesson, Harrison said softly, I used to think your weight was your burden. Now I see it was the world's shallow heart that was heavy, not you. Marcus smiled a little sadly. Perhaps we all carry too much until love teaches us what to set down. Isabella's fame never faded, but she chose to sing only his compositions. Critics called them the Whitmore Ballads, music that made audiences weep without knowing why. Each piece told fragments of their journey. Humiliation turned to hope, defiance tempered by tenderness. The city began to change with them. People grew a little kinder, a little slower to mock. When Harrison passed away, Marcus buried him beside the church bells that had once rung for their wedding. You finally learned to listen, Father, he whispered, and so did I. By then, he and Isabella had 3 children who adored them. Their eldest, a daughter, inherited her mother's voice and her father's compassion. On quiet evenings, The family would gather around the piano, and Isabella would sing while Marcus played, her voice and his music meeting in perfect understanding. And sometimes, after the children had gone to bed, they would sit in silence by the fire. Marcus would take her hand, tracing the faint lines time had drawn there, and say, "We were mocked for our weight once, mine in flesh, yours in fame. But look what our love lifted instead." Isabella would smile, her eyes glimmering with the same faith she'd had the night she first sang his melody. "It lifted the world," she'd whisper, because, in truth, it had. Winter returned to Boston many years later, softer now, gentler, as if even the snow had learned compassion. Inside the Whitmore Music Academy, the lamps still glowed through the evening fog. Children's voices faded down the hall, replaced by the quiet hum of a piano being closed for the night. Marcus sat beside the instrument, his hands resting on the keys, not to play, but to remember. The years had rounded his shoulders and silvered his hair, yet his smile remained the same, shy, patient, utterly kind. Isabella, wrapped in a shawl of pale blue, stood at the window, watching the first flakes fall. Her voice, though older, was still clear as morning light. He spoke without turning. "Do you ever think about that night, Isabella, the first time you sang my music?" She laughed softly. "Every time I open my mouth to sing, I do. That night I met the man who taught me that love is the bravest sound a heart can make." Marcus closed the piano lid and rose, joining her at the window. The city below glittered with lamplight, reflections trembling on the frozen Charles River. "And you," he said, "taught me that beauty isn't a mirror, it's mercy." They stood in silence, the rhythm of their breaths aligning like two notes sustained in perfect harmony. Beyond the glass, snowflakes spun like pages closing on the last act of their story. The opera that had begun in loneliness now ended in peace. When the clock struck 8, Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder. "Listen," she whispered. Marcus smiled. "To what?" "To the quiet. It's applauding us." He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Then let's take our final bow." And in that moment, as the city drifted into its winter sleep, the two souls who had once been mocked for daring to love stood hand in hand, proof that the gentlest hearts often leave the strongest echoes. If you've stayed with them until the final note, if you still believe that kindness can change the world one song, one act of courage, one embrace at a time, then tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what melody is your heart still carrying?